All right, so in these video notes, our topic is speciation, and we're going to talk about how speciation occurs. But before we begin, I want to talk about how species can change over time when it's not necessarily always natural selection acting on that population. So the first type we're going to talk about is genetic drift. And so, in fact, all of the ones we're talking about now are examples of genetic drift, and the population must be very small in order for you to see these types of changes. So again, I said in the beginning that it's going to be when the allele frequencies change due to chance rather than natural selection. So it's not really natural selection happening right now. It's more of a random change because of chance. It just randomly happened. And so it's random change in allele frequency. And so sometimes you can get a huge loss in genetic variation in a small population when you have a genetic drift. So there's going to be three types of genetic drift that we're going to be talking about. And so the first one is called bottlenecking effect. Bottlenecking effect usually is in a small population where a random natural disaster occurs, a huge tornado or a fire or a flood or a hurricane, or even maybe overhunting accidentally happens on the population. And so what happens is you lose genetic variation in a population and your allele frequency changes quite drastically. So this is an analogy for the bottlenecking effect. Look at all these yellows and blues in this population. There's a lot of variation. But then what happens at this point is a natural disaster. A huge forest fire happens, and only a few survive. And you can tell that there's not a lot of yellows. There's not a lot of yellow alleles, if you would say, if we use this as an analogy. And so as the population, after the next generation, you will see less of those yellow beads. And so that what we're saying is that more of the blue genetics were passed down because those were the ones that survived in this random drastic natural disaster. And so that could be one reason why alleles might change over time, is because of this sudden change that's quick in the environment over this population. Another example that I want to talk to you about is that these northern elephant seals, there used to be a lot of variation in these seals, but because of overhunting that happened back in the 1800s, they overhunted them so much that now there's only a few left, and they are hardly any genetic diversity because they don't have a lot left in the population for them to keep repopulating and kind of increasing their genetics frequencies and their gene pool because of so much overhunting. The second type of genetic drift is called the founder effect, and it's when you have a change in allele frequency in these small populations because new ones kind of develop in a new area. So they found a new area. That's why it's called founder effect. So for example, if a fish went in, decided to take a new fish and put it into a new body of water, or decided somehow went through a river and into a new body of water, it has found a new area, and now it's going to repopulate in that area. And so there's not going to be a variety of genetics or alleles in that gene pool in that new spot because they're now developing in a new area. So that could be another reason why you might see a change, and it's completely random for them to go into a new area. Gene flow is the third type of genetic drift, seeing genes drift back and forth in different alleles, is when you either have an addition or removal of alleles due to the population emigrating and immigrating, where they sometimes live in the population and they leave and sometimes go somewhere else. And an example of this could be a fish. Another example could be fish. And here is showing how the differences in temperatures for this tuna fish can move and cycle through different parts of the water. And so sometimes the population might have a variety of unique allele frequencies here, but then as soon as they leave and go up here, then their allele frequency in this small population has changed because they're not there anymore. They're not there to reproduce and to make new organisms and change the gene frequency by having offspring after offspring after offspring, because they're not there anymore. They changed and left that population. All right, so let's talk about speciation. And so when we think about a species, how does one species become two? Well, we usually really talk about reproductive isolation, meaning that they evolve into two separate species because they're not reproducing anymore together. And the three types of reproductive isolation we're going to talk about is behavioral isolation, geographic isolation, and temporal isolation. So let's just real quickly remind ourselves of what a species is. So a species is a group of individuals that look similar whose members are able to reproduce. So if you are of the same species, you can reproduce viable, fertile offspring, and then those can produce viable, fertile offspring. And so an example of a donkey and a horse is not the same species because yes, they can make a mule, but the mule is sterile. Mules can't make more mules. And so they're not the same species. But if you look at a Labrador and a poodle, they make a Labradoodle. Labradoodles can make more Labradoodles. So those are technically the same species. Labrador retrievers and poodles come from the same species. So when we talk about speciation, we're talking about forming of new species where those species cannot mate with each other anymore. And so now they have become separate species. And we try to identify and find and discover new species down in the deep, deep, dark ocean sometimes and in volcanoes and other kind of places. So let's talk about each one of those types of things. So when we say reproductive isolation, we are talking about how a population is splitting into two separate groups. And then over time, those two populations, because they've been split or somehow, they no longer interbreed. And then therefore, over a long period of time, that entire population, if you brought those two populations back together, they would not breed. And so they would be completely separate. And so if you look at this visual of how this was one population at one point, and then one went this way and one went this way due to something, and we'll talk about that something here in a minute. If you put these two together, they would not mate. And so then they would be separate species. So the first type we're going to talk about is behavioral isolation. Behavioral isolation is when these two populations, their courtship doesn't match anymore. So how they behave with each other, they aren't interacting together anymore. So this is an example of, they're called blue-footed boobies, and these birds have different rituals when they're mating. So this couple here, their courtship is through dancing. And if they're dancing well, then that helps them find a mate and reproduce. This species, even though they look very similar, they have a different behavior. This is a pointing display to help them figure out when they want to mate. And so their behaviors are different. And so these two together, this one and this one, would not mate together because they have completely different behavioral mechanisms that won't allow them to mate anymore. Geographical isolation is probably the most prevalent one we see with speciation occurring, is because geographically something happened and completely separated the two populations so they couldn't even get to each other. And so then of course, over time, they're in different environments. They can't get to each other. They can't obviously mate. So they might have been separated by a massive river one time, or this maybe a mountain slowly was created, or a big body of water all of a sudden happened. And so now they have been isolated for so long that if you brought them back together, they wouldn't mate anymore. So an example we have are squirrels. We have this kaibab squirrel and the Abbott's squirrel, and they were separated by the Grand Canyon a long, long time ago. And over a long, long period of time, they have changed based off their environment. And so you cannot put these two squirrels together and have them mate. They will not mate. And so they have, therefore, become two different species. And the third one is called temporal isolation. Temporal isolation is just saying in time. At one point in time, they reproduce at different points, and so they are not the same species. And so this is an example of an orchid. And this orchid lives in the rainforest, and literally this orchid and another orchid next to it are two different species because they open up and bloom at different times. And because they're bloomed at different times, those two won't interact and mix pollen together because they're not open at the same time. So that's another example of temporal meaning time. So those are some of the examples of how speciation can occur. And if you have a small population, how can random changes occur, like bottlenecking, and looking at those frequencies of alleles in this video.